She walked to the same scaffold where she once stood and watched another woman die. So why was the woman who helped send Anne Boleyn to her death executed 6 years later? Not for betrayal, but for understanding power too well. Because in the Tudor court, you didn't die from making mistakes. You died from surviving the wrong way for too long. Jane Boleyn stood inside Catherine Howard's chambers, watching a 19-year-old queen cry over love letters she was never supposed to keep. The room was private, heavy with silk and gold. Curtains muted the daylight. Along the walls, the faces of Henry VIII's former wives looked down in silence. Women who had once stood exactly where Catherine now stood, and were now only memory. "What should I do?" Catherine whispered. It was a simple question, and it was the question Jane Boleyn had been waiting to hear her entire life. Jane Parker entered the court of Henry VIII while she was still very young. She was not beautiful like Anne Boleyn, whose presence drew attention the moment she entered a room. She was not royal like Princess Mary, born into power without having to reach for it. But Jane was educated. She knew Latin. She spoke French. She understood etiquette, timing, and restraint, how to lower her eyes when powerful men decided her future. Most importantly, Jane learned something the others overlooked. She learned how to watch, how to listen, how to remember. In a court where everyone smiled and almost no one told the truth, invisibility was not a weakness. It was a survival skill. In 1525, Jane married George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. On paper, it was everything a woman at court could hope for. A title, security, and a direct connection to Anne Boleyn, a woman rising steadily toward the crown. In reality, Jane gained a husband who was rarely present. George spent his time at court, not at home. He wrote clever verses mocking marriage itself, lines that made other men laugh and left his wife quietly humiliated. His words traveled through the court as entertainment, while Jane absorbed them in silence. Other women wept over unfaithful husbands. Jane did not. She learned something more durable than grief. Tears did not change men. Secrets did. When Anne Boleyn became Queen of England, Jane Boleyn followed her into the inner rooms of power as a lady-in-waiting. The Queen's chambers were filled with mirrors, jewels, silk gowns laid carefully across chairs. Behind closed doors, voices rose and fell. Arguments ended abruptly when footsteps passed the corridor. Silence returned, heavy and unfinished. Jane stood close enough to see what the world outside never could. She heard the fear and never spoke in public. The fear of failing to give the king a son. She heard the king's anger, unpredictable, sharpening with time. She felt the pressure of succession pressing inward, turning a marriage into a test with a single acceptable result. Later, history would call these moments private. Inside the room, Jane understood they were dangerous. George Boleyn stood beside his sister when Anne's position grew dangerous. He defended her in council. He stepped closer when the king's temper sharpened, when privacy was needed, and then George switched into French, sharing jokes and conversations no one else was meant to hear. Jane watched all of it. She saw how her husband's loyalty never wavered, how he would risk everything for his sister, how he offered him protection, counsel, and presence. For Jane, there was nothing. This was not jealousy of affairs or whispered rumors. Jane was not jealous of desire. She was jealous of loyalty, the one thing her marriage had never given her. In 1534, Jane made her first serious miscalculation. She intervened in one of the king's private affairs, attempting to influence a relationship that was not hers to touch. The result was swift and unmistakable. Jane was removed from court. Not Anne, not George, only Jane. For 8 months, she lived in exile at her father's estate, watching the court from a distance. News arrived slowly, carried by letters and rumor. The king visited, and less often. His attention drifted toward Jane Seymour. The center of power was shifting again. During those long months, Jane reached a conclusion that would shape everything that followed. If her family would not protect her, she would protect herself. In early May of 1536, Anne Boleyn walked with Jane through the Queen's private garden. Spring flowers moved in the breeze. The walls were close. The space felt safe enough to speak. Anne was desperate. She spoke of her failure to produce a son. She spoke of the king's anger, his distance, his weakness. She spoke of her fear for Elizabeth. What would happen if Henry died without a male heir, and what that future meant for her child? Her words came quickly, tumbling over one another. driven by exhaustion and fear. To Anne, it was a moment of trust. To the law of Tudor England, it was treason. Questioning the king's sexual ability was treason. Discussing succession outside the king's presence was treason. Jane listened. She kept her face calm, and she understood something and did not. Jane was the only witness. Jane was summoned to answer questions before Thomas Cromwell. The interrogation room was plain and controlled. A polished wooden table, quills laid out like instruments, documents waiting to be filled with names and dates. Cromwell asked carefully, had she served the Queen closely? Had she heard private conversations? Had the Queen ever spoken of the king's personal matters? This was the moment Jane could have lied and joined her family in the Tower, or told the truth and watched them stand alone. Jane chose the truth, not out of honesty, out of calculation. Every word she spoke was accurate, and every word was lethal. By the time the quills stopped moving, 3 death sentences were already taking shape. George Boleyn was executed first, and Boleyn followed 2 days later. Jane did not stand beside them. She watched from a distance, separated by walls, windows, and silence. There was no public grief, no recorded outburst, only observation. When it was over, Jane woke as a widow. George's death erased his debts. His estates passed into her control. What blood had destroyed, law now transferred. Loss became liquidity. Execution became inheritance. In the Tudor court, death did not always end power. Sometimes it redistributed it. After Anne Boleyn's death, Jane did not retreat from court. She remained. She served Jane Seymour through pregnancy and childbirth, staying close as the Queen weakened and died. She adapted again when Anne of Cleves arrived, and stayed until that marriage collapsed into quiet dismissal. Queens came and went. The court rearranged itself. Jane adjusted without protest. She moved through birthing chambers and divorce negotiations, through ceremonies of arrival and moments of disappearance. Each transition taught her the same lesson. Queens were temporary. The women who survived them were not. Jane learned a truth as cold as the stone corridors she walked each day. When a queen died, her servants were remembered. When a queen lived, her servants were forgotten. And Jane Boleyn intended to be remembered. In 1540, Catherine Howard became Henry VIII's 5th wife. She was 19, beautiful, unprepared for the crown. Jane Boleyn was placed beside her as a trusted attendant, a woman who had survived queens before. Catherine saw comfort in Jane's presence, a connection to the Boleyn family she barely knew. Henry, by contrast, was no longer the man he had been. He was older, sick, and in constant pain. When he was absent, he was distant. When he was present, he was irritable and unpredictable. Jane taught Catherine how to perform the role of queen, how to smile at the right moment, how to laugh at jokes that no longer made sense, how to endure a tension that felt more like obligation than affection. And then, quietly, she taught her something else, how to hide. In the spring of 1541, Jane Boleyn began arranging private meetings between Queen Catherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper. They met in rose gardens after evening prayers, in empty corridors where footsteps faded quickly. Letters passed from hand to hand, carefully folded, carefully hidden. Jane was always nearby, watching, timing, managing what could be seen and what could not. She believed she understood the game. She had survived it before. She knew the risks, the law, the king's capacity for mercy and for violence. This time, she thought control was enough. For the first time in her life, Jane miscalculated. The investigation moved through the court with speed and fear. Catherine Howard was taken to the Tower first. Jane followed days later. The interrogation room had not changed since 1536. The same cold stone walls, the same smell of anxiety trapped in the air. Above the fireplace, Henry VIII's portrait watched in silence, as it always had. This time, Jane was not a witness. She was a suspect. The questions came with evidence already laid out. Letters in Catherine's hand, dates, places, names Jane herself had once managed. The strategy that had saved her before no longer worked. There were no secrets left to trade, no other lives to offer in exchange for her own. For the first time, survival had nothing to bargain with. As imprisonment dragged on, Jane began to break. She spoke to empty corners. She called for her dead husband as if he might answer. Guards reported that her thoughts no longer followed a straight line, that fear had finally fractured what calculation had once held together. Under English law, this should have mattered. For centuries, a person judged insane could not be executed. Henry VIII did not declare Jane sane. He did something colder. He declared sanity irrelevant. Through an emergency act of Parliament, the law itself was altered so that madness would no longer protect a woman who knew too much about too many queens. Dawn broke cold over Tower Green. Catherine Howard was executed first. She was 19 years old. She cried for her mother, followed the required ritual, confessed her crimes, praised the king, and asked for prayers. The axe fell. The crowd fell silent. Jane waited in her cell and listened. She heard the movement outside, the murmurs, the sound of wood being reset. When her turn came, she walked steadily toward the scaffold, the same ground where Anne Boleyn had died 6 years earlier. The block was still dark with morning blood. Jane followed the script perfectly. She asked forgiveness. She prayed for the king. She spoke in the careful language expected of a condemned noblewoman. She did not confess to betraying Anne. She did not speak of George. She did not explain herself. Jane Boleyn left no final story behind, only silence and a body that power no longer needed to remember. Jane Boleyn was buried without a marker. Her body was laid inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, among others who had fallen quietly out of favor. No stone recorded her name. No inscription explained her choices. History moved on without pausing to remember her. It would be easy to call Jane a villain, a manipulator, a woman who destroyed queens to save herself. But history is rarely that clean. Jane may not have been a monster. She may have been something more unsettling. The most accurate product of a court where survival depended on silence, observation, and knowing exactly when to speak. In a system that killed with laws instead of swords, Jane Boleyn learned how to live. She simply lived that way for too long. So which was Jane Boleyn? A calculated predator who learned how to destroy queens before they destroyed her? Or a pawn who understood the rules of Henry VIII's court too well and was ultimately crushed by its endless hunger for blood?